Welcome to Weekly Talkback. My name is Kevin Beers.
And I'm Pastor Dave.
And this week we are talking about Pastor Dave's message from May 21st, 2023. And if you haven't heard the sermon yet, you can find it in the description of this video. Go down there, click the link, listen to the sermon, and then come back. And we're going to dig into a couple of points that he made there. So, Pastor Dave, in your
Yes.
message, you defined the word sin as missing the mark, starting with the Greek word hamartia, meaning to miss the mark. And then you explained that Aristotle expanded the definition to include an error in judgment.
Right.
Now, personally, I've always defined sin as anything that separates us from God, or basically anything that takes us out of alignment with God's will.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
is my definition correct? And then how does that really align with the way you described it in your message?
Well, I mean, the thing that intrigued me about that whole process of investigating what the original meaning to the word sin is that in a strange but accurate sort of way, missing the mark is kind of, if you take it literally, it rings true when you think of, God's plan for you, God's seeking to achieve God's will, and by missing the mark, meaning you've strayed away from that path that brings you closer to God, that is aligning you with His Spirit, and that is doing the things that God would have you do. So the literal meaning actually, to me, fits pretty nicely. You've missed the mark, and so in some ways, I mean, I don't think that it's in disagreement with your definition of sin being separating from God, or being separate from, or putting a wedge between your relationship. I used to think define sin as that way, like that you've caused a wedge to become in place between you and God, and so there's yeah.
Yeah,
That's a lot of stuff.
yeah, and I guess my definition, it focuses more on the result, where the definition that you used in your message was more of a the process of what ends up being that separation from God.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the definition overall, it's just where the emphasis was between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now the past few weeks we've been talking about this, that many Christian words are losing their place in the English language. And one in particular is the word sin. Now, this comes directly from your message, but this three-letter word with all its baggage still addresses the moral ills of society today. We no longer speak of sin as the culprit for the wrongs in society. I thought that was an interesting concept, because I've always thought of sin as individual.
Mm-hmm.
And then you brought up the idea of sin is not only individual, but it's also corporate,
Mm-hmm.
that we build system. Like, I think your example from Genesis was when Adam and Eve sinned, that God cursed the ground, and therefore their sin caused basically a worldwide event of corruption.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So my question there is, what do you think has happened to cause all of that? Is it just Adam and Eve, and that's the result, or is it something we as humans somehow always make happen?
Yeah, I think both. I mean, I think biblically the story goes that it first happened with Adam and Eve, and then consequently generations just pick up on that. The Catholics always tried to explain it by that sin is transmitted from one generation to another generation through sexual relationship. Well, I don't buy it that way. I mean, the way I look at it is Adam and Eve is first man and first woman, but Adam and Eve is every man and every woman. And so it's the first Adam and Eve actually is representative of every Adam and Eve. And so it doesn't pass on. But on the other hand, and see, this is where I lose it a little bit because I'm not really well versed in all of this. I've not studied evil, but I do believe that there is a evil force somehow within and outside of us that is around and that can influence people. People get caught up in things. The Holocaust would be a good example. Why were so many Christians during the Holocaust either non-committal, and meaning that they kind of in a neutral position and went ahead and supported the war efforts of Nazism and Hitler? Why were so many Christians caught up in that? And why sometimes there are so many Christians caught up in any kind of movement that would be kind of contrary to God's will? And I think that there is a force outside of us too that though I don't understand it, we have to kind of contend with.
Okay, you're speaking of just a general evil.
Well, yeah, you could call it evil. The Bible calls it Satan or the devil. I think you can also call it sin, because I believe that sin can take a life of its own, and that's how it becomes more corporate. A collective group of sinners creates a force that's larger than themselves, larger than their individual sins. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. Going back to the point you were making about how many Christians were caught up in when we were talking about the Nazism. What you were saying sparked some thoughts in me of there were so many people that just went along because if they didn't go along, there were consequences to pay, and therefore they perpetuated the sin that was going on.
Yeah.
They were just complicit in what was going on around them.
Right.
It wasn't that they stood back and did nothing. It's like we actually participated in it, because if I don't, the consequences to me, it's more of a selfish. I got to focus on what's good for me and my family, which is a very human thing to do.
Right.
But at the same time, you're perpetuating someone else's sin and, in a sense, adding to it.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And you finished your message off by saying, with this from Matthew 16:26, what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul?
Mm-hmm.
How does that change the way we as Christians live our life? Do you think Christians in general think about it this way? Or I'm not sure exactly how to ask that. Are Christians really conscious of the fact that, hey, I'm doing something wrong. I know it's wrong, but there might be some kind of pleasure that comes from it, perhaps, or it doesn't seem to be so bad. But if we think about it, like, if we're actually putting on, I would say if Christians are thinking about, I'm putting my soul at risk doing this thing, be more likely not to do it. Do you think that's true, or do you think we've gotten to a point where sometimes we just don't care enough about our own?
Yeah, well, I think it's all of what you've said. I think that the world today, and I'm saying world, we had a discussion in the sermon about world being other than actually God's good creation. It's the language they use in the Bible referring to those things and those people that are not of God. But anyway, I think people today either believe in what Dietrich Bonhoeffer calls cheap grace, that all you got to do is just quickly ask forgiveness, and you can go on and live your miserable sinning life. But there are, in my opinion, in my faith, there are consequences for bad behavior. If we always have to rely on grace, and this comes out of the sermon too, because Paul had that argument about, should we keep on sinning so that grace abounds even more? And Paul's point is that's silly, because there are consequences to sin. And so, yeah, I don't think people really consider the fact that there are consequences to making bad choices. And not only, personally, not only to the family around you, not only to perhaps generations below you, but your own soul is at risk of being lost.
Okay, yeah. And, as you're talking, I get a lot of thoughts while you're talking because I was actually thinking about. There's been studies, scientific studies that show that, for instance, pornography in men actually produce bodily changes and changes in the chemicals in their brains. But that's something we'll have to discuss sometime. But it creates changes in our, physical changes in our bodies that are harmful in your relationships, with your spouse, and
yeah,
and actually your patterns of thinking will change also. So that in itself is harmful, and who would have thought that just something like that is actually going to change us physically? We talk, and of course the mental situation, especially for men. But the fact that your body changes, the way you think about certain things will change the way your body reacts to them. And that's just one aspect. I have a feeling that if we look at all the different sin in our life and how it affects us both physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, it's never good.
Right.
Right. If we follow what God wants for us, it's always good. So, it's hard to argue with, but why do we just stray down that path?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. And in some ways, it moves on to this wider discussion on social media. I was listening to the radio this morning about TikTok. Montana's going to outlaw TikTok because of its harmful effects on, in my opinion, a person's soul. People who watch it 4 or 5 hours a day, they tend to have higher risks of depression, higher risks of anxiety. They tend to feel more self-conscious and low self-esteem. All that. Isn't that part of what your soul really is? And so in some ways, overuse or abuse of social media goes back to this whole idea of sin. I think. That's kind of where I was going in my sermon yesterday or Sunday.
Okay, yeah, and as we talk about this on social media, we're actually considering getting on TikTok, but I look at it as we are actually combating what's out there with the good news through these messages that we're providing.
Absolutely.
So that will wrap it up for us this week on Weekly Talkback, and we hope to see you next week.
All right, take care. Be blessed.